Women in the United States were encouraged to work in factories during World War II, as the men had to go to war. A propaganda poster entitled "Rosie the Riveter" communicated to women the importance of helping the war effort and has now become a symbol of the women's rights movement as a whole. Rosalind P. Walter grew up in Long Island, New York. Though her family lived comfortably, the young ambitious Walter chose to join millions of other women supporting the troops during World War II. The role of Walter and other women who joined the efforts was to arm troops with mutants, warships, and aircraft, which basically means they tried fighting in the war like men did. Rosie the Riveter emerged as a cultural symbol in the U.S.
She inspired thousands of women to take up jobs in the munitions industry, manufacturing war supplies. Rosie the Riveter was a fictional character created by the government of the United States to encourage women to go to work during World War II.
The female percentage of the workforce in the United States increased from 27% to nearly 37%, although it was hard for women to work in factories because they also had to take care of their children and their home. Women were paid less than 50% of men's salary, and after the war, it was hard to get women to go back to working inside the home.
To accomplish this end, the U.S. Office of the War produced a variety of materials designed to convince these women to enter into war production jobs as part of their patriotic duty. Rosie the Riveter was a part of this propaganda campaign and became a symbol of women in the workforce during World War II.
Since many of these women had not previously worked outside the home and they had small children, the government not only had to convince women to join the workforce, but it also had to provide ways for women to care for their households and children.
The image of Rosie the Riveter was aimed to change public opinion about women's work.
American men left the industrial labor force to enlist during World War II in unprecedented numbers.
The idealized Rosie the Riveter exhibited numerous characteristics that the government and men found acceptable.
The traditional Rosie the Riveter story is not without omissions. White women benefited most from the labor changes, and many of the riveters were already in the labor force before World War II. Women took these jobs to support their families and their country. During the war years, the ranks of women in the workplace grew by nearly 60% to 20 million. Approximately 300,000 were the women ordnance workers who were most closely associated with Rosie the Riveter.
With Rosie's help, companies such as manufacturing giant Westinghouse encouraged women to become this labor force, and eventually the government also adopted the character to encourage sacrifice and effort as a support to the war effort. Both Rosie the Riveter campaigns announced opportunities for women to enter the workforce that had not been readily available due to economic and social conditions marked by the Great Depression prior to the war. Women took these jobs to support their families and their country.
Beginning in 1942, as an increasing number of American men were recruited for war and effort, women were needed to fill their positions in the factories.
Rosie the Riveter was a star of a campaign and recruiting female workers for defense industries during World War II, and she became perhaps the most iconic image of working women. Some women served near the front lines in the Army Nurse Corps, where 16 were killed as a result of direct enemy fire. 68 American servicewomen were captured as prisoners of war in the Philippines.
Rosie the Riveter was an iconic poster of a female factory worker, flexing her muscle, exhorting other women to join the World War II, with decoration that "We Can Do It" poster was aimed at boosting morale among workers in the World War II factories producing war material.
I didn't want fame or fortune, Freely told People magazine in 2016 when her connection to Rosie first became public, but I did want my own identity.
Some women were very young when they started working in factories. For example, Geraldine H. Doyle was only 17 when she started working in the factories. American women played important roles during World War II, both at home and in uniform.
Around 5 million civilian women survived in the defense industry and elsewhere in the commercial sector during World War II with the aim of freeing a man to fight.
From 1940 to 1945, during the years of the war, the female workforce increased from 27% to nearly 37%. More than half of these women took up tough jobs in the defense industry. By 1943, the U.S. aircraft industry employed over 3,001,100 women. It was 65% of the total employees in the industry, which was less than 1% in pre-war years. During the war, millions of women entered manufacturing and the workforce in general.
Over the years, a welter of American women have been identified as a model for Rosie, the war worker of 1940s popular culture who became a feminist touchstone in the late 20th century.
Rosie the Riveter wasn't an American culture icon. She represented the female workforce of World War II. She was first made up in a song in 1942, which inspired several replicas of her likeness in the following years when women were out in the workforce up until this very day.
Rosie the Riveter is important because during the time of war, just like in World War I, all of the men went after fighting in the war, while the women had to stay home and work. Then a song was made and inspired all of the women to fight for equal rights as the men. The legacy of Rosie the Riveter is also mixed when it comes to the job choices women make, despite the farther greater range we now have.
Women during Rosie the Riveter era also commanded American military aircrafts under the collective group named Women's Air Force Service Pilots.
The patriotic theme behind the entire Rosie the Riveter campaign gave American women four arguments regarding why they should go to work during the war, including the war would end sooner, more would die if they didn't go to work, if they didn't work they were slackers, if they didn't work they were like draft dodgers.
The women who did stay in the workforce continued to be paid less than their male peers and were actually demoted. The women were barely making 71 cents.
In the immediate post-war years, women workers only earned roughly 60 cents for every dollar a man made. Today, it's 83 cents on the dollar.
But after their selfless efforts during World War II, men could longer claim superiority over women. Rosie the Riveter was not intended to be used to enhance women's role in society, but in later years, Rosie was used in the feminist movement.
But when men came home from the war, women were pushed out of the well-paying manufacturing jobs and sent back to the kitchen, or at least to jobs of low pay and little respect. Even for women whose paychecks were essential to their families' incomes, there was no protection against getting fired simply for being a woman.
Rosie the Riveter mentioned the glass ceiling, which was basically her getting women to join the workforce while men were at war. She also wanted women to be paid the same as men since they were getting paid less.
According to some historians, Rosie the Riveter was developed as a moral booster to uphold the production rate in factories, rather than a call to women to do men's jobs. Women in War Jobs campaign is considered to be the advertising industry's most successful recruitment campaign in the USA.
Yet despite her success, Rosie was forced off the factory floor when the war ended, her achievements buried in books, all her accomplishments wiped out of her consciousness. She had proven her abilities, but she remained that cultural enigma, a woman in a man's job.
While Rosie the Riveter may seem like a quaint historical figure to some people in story, it contains prudent, even urgent lessons for women in management today. The United States government and Americans in general refer to these women as Rosie the Riveter.